Welcome to the inaugural Doughty Street Chambers Holocaust Memorial Day event. My name is Adam Wagner and I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and I'm honoured to chair today's session, which I hope will become an annual event. Today, the 27th of January, 2021, marks 76 years since the Soviet forces arrived at Auschwitz, a complex of over 40 death camps where 1.1 million people, Jews, Poles, Roma and others, were murdered. I'm a British Jew. My family, like that of many British Jews, came to Britain as refugees from persecution over 100 years ago. All four of my grandparents were in the armed forces during the Second World War. And during a recent VE Day anniversary celebration, my 10-year-old son asked me, "Daddy, what would have happened if Germany had won the war?" I didn't miss a beat. I told him truthfully that my grandparents would have been marched to the death camps and murdered. Our family, as exists today, would not exist. Although Hitler ultimately lost the war, in the most part, he won his war against Europe's Jews. In 1939, there were between 9 and 10 million Jews in Europe, communities that stretch back almost 2,000 years. On the 27th of January, 1945, only about 3.8 million survived. 2/3 had been murdered. They were murdered by many means. They were murdered by hunger. They were murdered by torture. They were murdered by shooting. They were murdered by slavery. And they were murdered by gas. And as if 6 million Jews was not enough, the Nazis targeted others, including Roma and Sinti. An estimated 200,000 were murdered, around 25% of the pre-war population, itself one of the worst genocides in world history. Gay men and trans people, people of color, disabled children and adults, including those in psychiatric hospitals, all persecuted and murdered. How do we mark such horror? What else can I tell my children apart from that we are the fortunate remnants of a decimated civilization? There are at least two ways. First, we remember, in Hebrew, lezachor. The Holocaust was so successful that entire families, entire communities were wiped out. There is nobody left to remember them but us. We cannot turn back the clock, but we can remember and honor those lives. This is even more important with every passing year as the remaining lights of the few survivors of the Holocaust are extinguished. So we remember. The second thing we can do is try to understand. In Hebrew, lahavin. The Holocaust was a unique genocide in many ways, but it also shares features with other genocides. After 1945, the world tried to understand the Holocaust. The most important result of that understanding was the international institutions which we created. The United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, the Nuremberg tribunals, the concept of crimes against humanity. The rights in the 1948 Universal Declaration were a list of the very rights which were systematically denied the Jews and other persecuted groups. But the sad fact is we do not remember enough and we do not understand enough, because genocides have happened again and again since the 27th of January, 1945. In Rwanda, Cambodia, and Sudan, even in Europe, in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So what can we hope to do in the face of this ongoing horror? We can't change the past, but we can influence the future. We can remember, we can understand, and then, most importantly, we can act. By standing up for rights today, by fighting hate and injustice where we find it. Those are the values we can stand for together. And indeed, those are the values that we at Doughty Street Chambers stand for. And on those themes of remembering, understanding, and acting, we will hear today from 5 speakers with a mixture of live talks and videos. I will have to be strict with timing as we only have you for an hour, but we will hear from Rabbi Naftali Schiff, Amos Waldman, Marissa Cohen, John Hobson, and Rahima Mahmut. The first speaker is Rabbi Naftali Schiff, founder and chief executive of Jewish Futures, a not-for-profit international organization which creates, incubates, and scales dynamic educational organizations and initiatives, propelling each forward to ensure vibrant Jewish futures. Welcome, Rabbi Schiff.
Good afternoon. I'm not going to give a talk. That's the good news. It's just a privilege to be able to present to you a very short video compilation taken from 3 interviews of personal conversations that I conducted just this week with 3 non-Nigerian survivors that live in our midst. The gradual erosion of human rights stands out from each conversation. I know this is something that your chambers is committed to eradicating, and as a rabbi, as a British Jew, we are so appreciative to live in a country with an operation like yourselves, chambers like yourselves are devoted to such values. The choices of each of these survivors and the families took are stark, but I think the most powerful thing is these are choices that each of us can make each and every day. Adam, I hope I kept to my time. That's it. Here's the video.
Stop now. Thank you.
My name is Manfred Goldberg, Michael, but Manfred in German. I was born on the 21st of April, 1930, in Germany, in a town called Kassel, where my parents lived. I can tell you that when the Nazis came into power, you're probably well aware of this, they lost no time in beginning to pass anti-Jewish laws. Jews lost their nationality and therefore all their civil rights. All Jewish civil servants were dismissed. Jewish doctors were not allowed to treat non-Jewish patients. Jewish lawyers weren't allowed to represent non-Jews. Jewish shops had the word Jew painted on their shop windows to discourage non-Jews from entering and buying from them. Many non-Jewish shops put up signs in their door, Jews not welcome. Later that changed to Jews not permitted to enter. Initially it was just optional, and many shops said Jews not welcome. And so it went on. Eventually, we were not allowed to own a radio at some point. We were not allowed to go to a cinema. We were not allowed to sit on a park bench. We were not allowed to vote, of course, that goes without saying. Eventually, shortly after Kristallnacht, our Jewish school was forcibly closed, and all Jewish children who attended non-Jewish schools were expelled. So there was no further education for any Jewish child after some time in early 1939. Look, by the time I was 3 years old, in 1933, the Nazis came to power. And the Nazis lost no time indoctrinating German youth. They formed more or less immediately an organization called the Hitlerjugend, Hitler Youth. And it became the done thing for parents to enroll their children in this organization, which concentrated on instilling Jew hatred into them. And I do remember being accosted occasionally. Mainly in the early days, it was just by youngsters shouting "dirty Jew" and making sort of threatening moves, but not actually hurting me. So I do remember anti-Semitism growing. Well, the first really clear memory of what was happening and what was in store was Kristallnacht, when I was 8 years old. We lived in an apartment building which had, I think, 6 apartments. The rest were non-Jewish tenants. And one of them was a non-Jewish policeman who served as a policeman in Kassel. And he became quite friendly with my father. My father had become a textile merchant in a very modest way. And this policeman had been one of his customers because he had a stock of goods at home. So it was very easy for the as his name was Dilling, for Mr. Dilling to come in, and my father would serve him nicely. And as a result, there was goodwill towards my father. And days before Kristallnacht, this policeman met my father on the stairs, and he whispered to him, "I cannot tell you anything specific, but it is in your interest to disappear for a while." And my father took the hint, and he disappeared. And it was just my mother with us two little children. I was 8, my little brother was 4, who witnessed Kristallnacht. We were indoors, but from the window of our apartment, we could look into the street, and we saw mobs of Germans in a frenzy, led by Nazis in brown uniforms called the SA. I think in German it was Sturmabteilung, so Storm Division. They were the bully boys. They were leading the mob. And if they met any Jews in the street, they were either beaten up. I think dozens of Jews were actually murdered during that night. We will teach the Jews. We will teach them. They've got it coming to them. That sort of language. We couldn't really understand much. We couldn't be too obviously watching from the window, because even that wasn't safe. I can tell you, in retrospect, I realize how desperate the situation occasionally must have been, because I recall my mother, Alea Sholem, getting my little boy looked after by someone and asking me to come with her. And we walked to a street corner not far from us, and we stopped opposite a non-Jewish bakery, which of course we were not allowed to enter. My mother had taken my school satchel with her. She handed me my school satchel, asked me to carry it in a way which would cover my yellow star. She gave me a sum of money, coins, into my hand, and we rehearsed very seriously and repeatedly what I was to do. We were looking at this baker's shop, and when there was no one in the shop, she would ask me to run across, enter the shop, ask for a large bread, put the money on the counter, take the bread and run out again. And when I could promise her that I had remembered all her instructions, when the shop was empty, she sent me racing across. I did what she'd asked me. And it seemed to me that the young woman serving behind the counter did sort of recognize me, because we were local there, and she may well have suspected that I was Jewish. My yellow star was covered up, of course, but nevertheless, she didn't say anything. She gave me the loaf of bread, and I ran out, and this is how we managed to obtain some food.
Mr. Goldberg, you had your bar mitzvah in the Riga ghetto.
I did, or you know that, yes.
March 1943.
Correct. I didn't attend any services in the camps throughout. The only religious service ever was the day of my bar mitzvah. And this was completely organized by that teacher, Herr Bacher. It was a miracle that this teacher managed to get together 9 people. And I had the privilege of being counted number 10 for the first time in my life. I mean, in retrospect, I realize the significance. At the time, I didn't really properly appreciate what was happening. I cannot tell you in what esteem, what admiration I hold this teacher. He was such a dedicated person who was prepared to more or less devote his life to people like me, because there was a consequence to what he did. I can tell you in all honesty and from my heart that you will never fully be able to understand or anticipate the lifelong impact your behavior towards children will have in later life. To you, it may just be a transient occasion, but to children, many of these occasions are lasting memories. And it can have vast consequences in later life. Please remember that when you're tempted to be short-tempered or resentful towards a child that may not respond in the way you would like it to. Please be patient and remember that there are consequences to one's actions and above all to one's words. Once words are spoken, they can never be unspoken. I remember that clearly, and it's a lesson I have been learning quite early in life after liberation, and I have been, or I've tried to be, as careful, extra careful before speaking. I'm known as the silent type because I really appreciate that often silence is golden, where speech is not.
I said goodbye to my father and my sister on the platform of the train, on the platform, I mean, of the station, because I traveled with Mum to Hamburg, where I was going to board a ship to come to England. So the last time I saw my father alive was then, at the beginning of March 1939. Probably tears down my eyes, but comfort with my mother going with me. So perhaps I might have thought she's coming with me to England. But
so your mother went on the train with you to Hamburg, and then
yes.
What happened?
Eventually, we were separated. I went on, SS Manhattan, which was one of the America, whatever it was called, line of companies which plied from Hamburg to New York, as did sister ship, the SS Washington. It seems, from what I've been told later and found out, that the owners of the ship, the company, were willing to take Kinder on board in limited numbers and take them to England. And I was evacuated into a little village in Staffordshire called Hammeridge, the back of which can be seen from the M6 toll road, and another young man from the hostel. We were put up with a non-Jewish family, a lovely elderly family, no children of their own. I had to make my life there as best as I could.
And Reverend Cohen, you were also honoured by the Queen with an MBE for your work in Holocaust education.
Yes, I have the MBE, of which I'm very proud. I do a lot of Holocaust education, going to schools, talking to them, adults as well. In fact, I even went back to Germany to speak. And at the moment, of course, business is virtually closed in that area because schools are closed and have been closed. If I can put it this way, at my age at the moment, I'm not 21 anymore, but I have a sort of motto, if it's the right word. The past is something that has gone. It's with me. It made my today, and today makes my tomorrow. So in other words, I'm reconciled to the fact, no parents, nothing I can do about it. So I've had to live with that. I can't do it, I can't undo it. And let others enjoy the pleasure of being with whoever they are. And that pleasure comes from my son and my daughter, their children, grandchildren, and my great-grandchildren.
My name is David Marks. I'm 92 years old, a Holocaust survivor, and I have the chance and to tell a little bit what I learned after the Holocaust survivor. I was in Birkenau and Auschwitz, and the most what we need was food and freedom. Those two items are the most important thing for a person. And if you don't have it, you are nechshav like a mat. You are not even alive. So I have a message to people which for years how important freedom is. And unfortunately, the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, what we saw up in Washington, I want everybody should realize, and they should keep an open mind that it's very fragile. My message to the next generation, be honest, keep busy, and live a full life, never give up, and look for the future. I'm fortunate enough because I always believed in the future, and I always said, never give up. And I thank God I met the love of my life at the age 92, and I married her New Year's, and the best is yet to come, and we're going to have a wonderful future.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So if you want me to add 30 seconds, the 30 seconds that I would say in the tens of survivors that I have spoken to in the last few months, I have not heard one word of complaint. Frustration, yes, but not one word of complaint. Their choice to live, to build, to share tolerance and love has just been absolutely remarkable. And as I said before, those are choices we can all make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Schiff, and to the 3 survivors who took part in those interviews. Our next speaker is Marissa Curran, a Doughty Street Chambers barrister who specializes in immigration and community care. Marissa will talk about the experimentation and murder of disabled children and adults, known as Aktion T4.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this event. My name is Marisa Cohen, and I am a barrister here at Doughty Street. As some of you know, I am Jewish. I am also deaf and visually impaired. Some of my extended family members were killed during the Holocaust. I've been asked to talk about a programme that took place in the Holocaust, which was known as Aktion T4. Aktion T4 targeted children and adults with physical disabilities, intellectual disabilities, and psychosocial disabilities, who were among the first victims of the Nazi regime in being targeted for forced sterilisation and murder. The programme was an exercise in eugenics in scientifically controlling Germany's gene pool. As is now well known, various groups of persons were targeted by the Nazi regime for their perceived genetic inferiorities, including Jewish people, Roma and Sinti people, and LGBT people, as well as disabled people. Aktion T4 started by euthanizing, killing, disabled children who were considered unworthy of living, and came to include the compulsory sterilisation of an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 disabled adults. It expanded to the killing of a further 400,000 disabled children, adults, and the elderly. Sadly, the programme operated with the enthusiastic support of the medical profession on the basis of theories on eugenics, which included reference to the economics of spending money on persons who were considered unable to contribute to society. This part of the medical profession had history. In the 1920s, the disabled were mistreated, sterilised, experimented on, and killed in some German psychiatric institutions. In 1920, the psychiatrist Alfred Hooch and the jurist Karl Binding published their treatise on permitting the destruction of unworthy life, which became the blueprint of the exterminations of the disabled by the Nazi regime. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, Jewish psychiatric patients during the Nazi regime suffered a double stigma. They were separated from other patients and denied pastoral care. They were cared for not at the expense of the Third Reich, but by Jewish organisations. They were then singled out for even earlier extermination. There is a psychiatric hospital in the Berlin suburb of Wittenau, known as the Karl Bonhoeffer Psychiatric Hospital. By December 1942, every Jewish patient there had been killed. That those with disabilities were targeted as some of the first victims for murder is particularly chilling, because of course that meant that they were subject to the testing of different methods of mass killing before these were refined, and the executors went on to establish and run the extermination camps at Treblinka, Balzac, and Sobibor. In the trial of those who carried out Aktion T4, 23 German doctors and administrators were convicted for their participation in the programme, which in turn raised some awareness of the targeted killings of this particular group of people. Our very own Oliver's excellent chapter in the book Foundations of Global Health and Human Rights observes that following the Holocaust, the International Human Rights Project paid little attention to the rights of people with disabilities, until the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came about. Part of the explanation perhaps reflects the unwillingness of society then to talk and reflect on the people who were targeted, as well as the stigmatisation of victims, survivors and their families in Germany and other areas in Europe following the Holocaust. All of this means that it is even more important now for us to continue to reflect on the tragedies of the Holocaust and to talk about the victims. The fact that we are losing our very last survivors of the Holocaust places a very heavy burden and responsibility on us as a society to continue to honour their memories and to attempt to learn from the past. As we have seen, the way in which we characterise people matters. The language that we use and do not use matters. The exercise of categorising those according to their abilities or disabilities matters. And above all, the respect for the fundamental dignity of persons matters. Thank you very much for listening.
Adam, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Marissa. Our next speaker is Amos Waldman, a Doughty Street Chambers barrister based in Manchester, who specialises in criminal law and court of protection work. Amos is also a former schoolmate of mine. We both went to the same Jewish primary school in Manchester. Amos will reflect on the themes of retribution and forgiveness. Thank you, Amos.
Thanks. Good afternoon. Before I do, I just want to say that the Holocaust has always been something I've been encouraged to think about from a young age, whether it's at home, school, Sunday school or synagogue. It's always been on my mind when I've travelled, whether it's been to Yad Vashem, Auschwitz or the Pinkas Synagogue in Prague. It's an intrinsic part of me and my family history. My father's side of the family came from Russia and the Ukraine. My mother's side originated from Poland. My grandparents came to the UK before the Holocaust, but many of their family members weren't so fortunate. My father's father served as a doctor in the army in the Second World War, and he was based in the Middle East for 3 years. Typically, as in many Jewish families, family members didn't want to speak about the events which led them to move to the UK. And it's difficult to obtain information. One of my father's brother's wives came to the UK on the Kinder transport. My mother, whose mother sadly passed away in April, took great interest in her lineage. She spoke a lot about her side of the family, and to that end, she was assisted by Saul Marks, who's a Liverpool-based genealogist who's appeared on BBC's Air Hunters. And he, fortunately, was able to find out a great deal about her side of the family. Managed to track the family back to Radzilov in Poland in 1843, where the family were initially fishermen. They later became tailors, and some family moved to London. Unfortunately, 72 family members, of course this is only one section of the family, died during the Holocaust. Some of them were victims of the Jawadny and Radzylav pogroms in Poland in 1941. Some, having survived the initial pogroms, were later killed by Nazis. Some of the children were sent to Bukhara in Russia, and several were sent to and died in Auschwitz. Against that background, the protection of human rights has always been extremely important to me. And in the earlier years of my practice at the bar, focused on crime and some immigration, asylum and human rights. Since then, I've been fortunate enough to become a Doughty Street tenant in 2011, which has given me the opportunity to develop further a human rights practice in crime, international crime, and also court of protection. I've done some work at the International Criminal Court in The Hague. Practicing at the bar has given me the opportunity to see human behaviour at its best and its worst, and forgiveness and retribution often feature in cases which are litigated, particularly criminal cases. The extent of them depends on the level and type of wrongdoing and the personalities involved. Both are natural feelings and both exist as a way for humans to deal with certain situations. Neither are wrong, but a desire for retribution, if it's dealt with through proper channels, can successfully deal with some situations. If it's directed to achieve justice, it can prevent a wrongdoer from repeating their behaviour. Forgiveness and a conciliatory approach can also, in the right context, have a positive effect if it's accompanied by genuine remorse from a wrongdoer. But litigation doesn't always result in a successful outcome, in my experience, and often it's inflammatory. But for it to have a chance of a successful result, it must be fair and human rights compliant. As an extreme example of both forgiveness and retribution, I was fortunate enough to chair a question and answer session with a producer and director, Ricky Gerwitz and Matthew Scheuscher, following a UK premiere of the film The Accountant of Auschwitz at the Jewish Film Festival 2 years ago. It's an incredibly powerful film based on Oscar Groening, who stood trial at the age of 93 and was convicted of being an accessory to murders which took place at Auschwitz. He was responsible for documenting and sorting property and money from arrivals at the concentration camp, the issue at the trial being whether in that role he participated in law to the atrocities which took place. The factual background was fascinating, and he came to the attention of the authorities initially through his public response to Holocaust deniers, including to the BBC. He denounced it and relayed what he'd witnessed to numerous people who held those views, but he never really demonstrated contrition. He didn't acknowledge the importance of his role in the running of the concentration camp. I highly recommend the film, which looks at the trial through the lenses of participants and examines all the issues which arose in trying him so long after the events at an old age. One of the remarkable and polarising features of the trial in the film was the response of a witness who gave evidence, Eva Moses Kaur. She was only 10 years old when she and her twin sister were held at Auschwitz, and they were the subject of horrific experiments at the hands of Joseph Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death. They lost their parents and older sister at Auschwitz, but after giving evidence, she hugged the defendant. Her conduct was the subject of widespread condemnation, including by other witnesses at the trial. But she later stood by her actions, described it as one of those meetings between two worlds that at one time would not have been possible. She felt that at that point he was remorseful, it was an act of kindness, and she'd been able to forgive. She even suggested that reclaiming her personal power was the ultimate revenge. But she was clear she hadn't forgotten. She may have forgiven, but she hadn't forgotten. But what's clear from that trial and the events which occurred during the Holocaust is that the other human rights atrocities cannot and will not be forgotten, and human rights are fundamental in that. They apply to everyone. They're certainly important to me and the work which I will continue to pursue. Having seen in many criminal trials the long-lasting effects of seeking retribution, which are sometimes not satiated, it does leave in some cases the question as to whether or not more enduring and real justice can be obtained in a manner other than a trial. Thank you.
Thank you, Amos. Extremely thought-provoking, I'm sure, for everybody. Our next speaker is John Hobson, who's a Doughty Street barrister based in Manchester, who specialises in housing law, inquests and public law. John will speak about the Nazi persecution of LGBT people.
Nazi ideology and its attendant regime targeted those who didn't fit into an ideal of what was considered to be normal. Whilst existing law in Germany, paragraph 175, had long criminalised certain sexual acts between men, in Germany's larger cities, a vibrant gay and lesbian culture had emerged and flourished. Upon this seam of entrenched prejudice, the Nazis moved against the culture generally, and gay men in particular. A period captured in the 1939 novel Goodbye to Berlin, and later reflected in the music and film Cabaret. In 1933, the Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, whose work included pioneering research and support for transgendered people, was ransacked and its books publicly burned. In 1935, paragraph 175 was widened to the extent that a kiss or an embrace could be deemed punishable. In 1933, there had been 850 convictions under the law. By 1938, the figure was over 8,500. Following the annexation of Austria, a new penal code was extended and covered lesbian women. An estimated 50,000 gay and bisexual men were sentenced to prison terms, varying from a few months to several years. An estimated 10,000 to 15,000 men were sent to labour and concentration camps. Forced to wear a pink triangle to identify them to their guards and fellow prisoners, many were subject to violence and abuse. Many died from exhaustion due to heavy labour, and as the war progressed, some were subject to castration and medical experiments. Until his death in 2011, Rudolf Brasda was the last known camp survivor, specifically deported on the basis of his homosexuality. Sent to Buchenwald concentration camp in August 1942, he remained there for nearly 3 years. He eventually broke his long silence about his experience of persecution upon hearing of the unveiling of a memorial to homosexual victims of the Nazis. In the final few years of his life, he continued to speak, warning of where prejudice and oppression can lead. At the beginning of her remarkable book, Denying the Holocaust, The Growing Assault on Truth and Memory, the academic and author Deborah Lipstadt wrote the following, and then quoted from ancient scripture, from the book of Deuteronomy. To the victims and survivors of the Holocaust, and to those who preserve and tell their story, remember the days of yore. Learn the lessons of generations that came before you. It is often said that the past is always present. Elsewhere, that those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And furthermore, that eternal vigilance is the price of freedom.
Thank you to John Hobson. If you want to see more about that awful time for LGBT people, I recommend the series Transparent on Amazon Prime, which has parts of its flashbacks to some of the events that John just spoke about. But he said those who don't forget the past are condemned to repeat it. And I think that is a truism, and it's true. In July of last year, 13 tons of human hair were seized by US customs, and they are thought to have come from Uyghur Muslims who are currently being persecuted and ethnically cleansed in China. To talk about this modern and current atrocity, I'd like to introduce Rahima Mahmut, a London-based Uyghur singer, award-winning translator, and human rights activist.
Hello, and thank you so much for Oliver Lewis for inviting me to speak. I feel very honored to be able to address you on Holocaust Memorial Day and to have the opportunity to share my experiences. For those who do not know me, I am Rahima Mahmut, the UK Project Director of the World Uyghur Congress. Today, we commemorate the lives of those who fell victim to the most horrific crimes of the 20th and 21st centuries: the Holocaust, the Rwanda, Cambodian, Bosnian, and Darfur genocides. We pay respect to the people whose lives were lost, communities destroyed, and cultures desecrated. In the 30s and 40s, the Nazi Party were explicit in their aims, not only destroying the Jewish people, but of eradicating their memory from the face of the earth. Therefore, our remembrance is a defined act by honoring those who perished and listening to the testimonies of those who survived. We ensure that their memories will live on forever. Yet, as we gather to reflect on the atrocities of years gone by, I would ask you to spare a moment for those who are currently subject to persecution. Since 2017, much of the world has closed its eyes to the brutal ethnic cleansing and genocide of my people, the Uyghurs, conducted by the Chinese government. This oppression is nothing new. I, for one, left my beloved homeland and my entire family to come to the UK back in September 2000. After witnessing the violent suppression of peaceful demonstrations against my people firsthand. However, over the past 4 years, the situation in the Uyghur region has rapidly escalated. 4 years ago, I lost contact with my family. In my last conversation with my brother, he said to me, "Please leave us in God's hands. We leave you in God's hands too." Not long after this exchange, news of the mass internment of Uyghurs and placing them in so-called reeducation camps started to emerge. The Chinese government claims it targets Uyghurs in order to crack down on religious extremism. In reality, to become an extremist, in their eyes, you only need to participate in the Uyghur culture or religion. Activities as minor as growing beard, giving your child a name considered too Islamic, or attending a mosque can be cause for incarceration. It is perhaps only as we recall the darkest times of our history that the scale of what is happening to my people can be comprehended. Just to give you an idea about the sheer scale of what is happening. Up to 3 million of my fellow Uyghurs are interned behind the wires and the walls of a network of more than 1,000 camps. 500,000 Uyghurs who have been transported to work as slaves in cotton fields. Hundreds of thousands more are forced to work in factories built inside or alongside the camps. 1 million children stolen from their parents and taken to secure boarding schools, where their language and culture is taken away from them. 6,000 mosques demolished, hundreds of Muslim graveyards destroyed, millions of women facing forced sterilization, forced abortions, forced marriage to Han Chinese men. These are numbers. The Holocaust survivor Abel Herzberg said to the genocide he survived, "There were not 6 million Jews murdered. There was one murder 6 million times." Behind the numbers of the crimes being committed against Uyghurs are millions of stories of individual suffering. My work as an interpreter and translator brings me into contact with first-hand accounts of camp survivors, as well as the heart-wrenching tales of mothers and fathers who have lost their children, young and old. Every Uyghur family has a similar story, each more horrifying than the other. From accounts given by camp survivors who were released due to being foreign nationals, life inside the camps was one of horror. Detainees were subject to brainwashing, torture, lack of food, overcrowding, sleep deprivation, mass rape, forced sterilization, and forced labor. Gulbahar Haitwaji is a Uyghur woman who was released from one of these camps in 2019. She recalled, "Death lurked in every corner. When the nurses grabbed my arm to vaccinate me, I thought they were poisoning me. In reality, they were sterilizing us. That was when I understood the method of the camps, the strategy being implemented, not to kill us in cold blood, but to make us slowly disappear, so slowly that no one would notice." All genocides are distinct and unique, and so too is the Uyghur genocide. If the Holocaust was the first industrial genocide, then for Uyghur, we have the terrible honor of being the first high-tech genocide. Everywhere we are watched, cameras every few yards, facial recognition taught by artificial intelligence to racially profile, mobile telephones monitored, and huge DNA databases. Alongside what is new is what is painfully familiar. So many of my Jewish friends have told me of how old scars are reopened as they see news footage of Uyghurs rounded up and forced onto trains, or read the stories of Uyghurs being forcibly shaved and having their hair sold, or when they see layout of camps themselves, the rows of bunks, the guard towers, the doctors using their knowledge to destroy a people rather than to heal them. This is undoubtedly why, while many are only waking up to the horrors in the region now, the same cannot be said of the British Jewish community, who have been strong allies to Uyghurs. I would like to take this moment to express from the bottom of my heart my most sincere gratitude to this community for all your support and solidarity over the last few years. Recently, as you may be aware, the US Department declared that they believe there is a genocide happening in the Uyghur region. We welcome this recognition of our plight. We hope that in the near future, the UK courts will have the power to make a similar determination. Today, the only route for such a decision is United Nations, where China has a veto, or the International Criminal Court, to which China is not a party. Last week, a vote to give the court determination powers was narrowly defeated in the Commons, but a similar version of the amendment has already been tabled and is set to be debated imminently. People ask me, how can we help? This is how. Ask your MP to vote for the genocide amendment to make sure we Uyghurs get our day in court. As the late Rabbi Sachs wrote shortly before he passed, the crimes against Uyghurs are not just a moral outrage, they are a political scandal. Every year as we gather to remember the lost, the Jews, the Cambodians, the Bosnians, the Darfurs, our politicians will write never again in their social media posts, as they post photographs of themselves staring solemnly into the camera as they sign the books of remembrance. Do our politicians really mean it? Are they acting or will they act? Because to be meaningful, never again must be a promise, not just a platitude. I ask you as a Uyghur and a fellow human being, please help us. In years to come on this day, we will look back at a culture and a people we protected. or we will be saying yet again, never again, as we commemorate the Uyghur genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahima. I'm sure I speak for everybody in saying that was an extraordinary intervention, and and just goes to show that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it, and we must act. I want to introduce, to finish up, a short film that I had the privilege in helping to produce a couple of years ago, involving 3 survivors of different genocides. And it was made by a charity that I set up called Rights Info, which is now called Each Other. It's called The Warning Signs.
I think there were definitely warning signs there, but I don't think they were so much ignored as denied.
Something serious was building up, but never thought that it was going to be horrible as it turned out to be.
History can teach us so much, but we keep ignoring history lessons at our own peril all the time.
I was born in 1935, when the Nazis were already 4 years in power. I was very sheltered. I was blissfully unaware of what was going on outside.
I was born and raised in rural Bosnia. My family had lots of animals. We grew some crops. My childhood was pretty much idyllic.
I grew up in a very stable family environment. I went to school. I played football.
When I was a teenager, some media started employing propaganda to vilify one particular group, Albanians. After 1984, this propaganda became more vicious.
The government of that time put in place those rules that Hutus had more right to jobs and education, and then Tutsis had less.
The Jewish community was used to persecution and mostly thought that if they didn't make trouble, it would all blow over. And it wasn't until Kristallnacht that they really woke up to realizing it wasn't going to blow over.
I went to this primary school. The teacher asked to raise our hands, Tutsis on this side, Hutus on that side.
Almost immediately after the Nazis came to power, my father was sacked from his position as a judge. Aryan Germans were not allowed to employ Jews.
A number of friends and family members got arrested purely because they were Tutsis.
I came to England on the Kinder transport in 1939. I can remember being very shocked at the huge size of the boat. I remember being frightened that the boat would sink. Too many people and too much luggage.
I ended up in the Amarska camp, the most notorious concentration camp in Bosnia. I was there for 2.5 months, but every day was like a whole eternity because you just want to survive, you just want to live.
Most of the population were terrified. The Nazis dominated and terrorized. They completely perverted the legal profession, the teaching profession, the medical profession.
During the genocide, I lost so many family members, including a young brother of mine who was just 7 years old at the time.
After 2 weeks, they began the process of interrogations. But I say interrogations, but it was really the process of torture.
It became normal to call a Tutsi a cockroach. I think we somehow accepted it. A number of people went out and killed their fellow human beings without actually realizing that they were killing the really human beings. They believed that they were cockroaches.
The lessons of the Holocaust have not been learned. The fundamental lesson that all human beings are equal as human beings, we're a long way from accepting that.
In 1992, history came knocking on my door and I became a victim of genocide. Right now, history seems to be knocking on everyone's door. We constantly have to fight for our human rights because so many people before us have fought for them and died for them.
I'm only one person. I can't do anything about it anyway. I think that was probably the attitude of most people and still is today. We need a massive drive to raise awareness of the existence of human rights.
I have seen and survived something that I feel no human being should ever be aware of. I feel that humanity can benefit from such stories in hope that they don't have to go through the same experiences.
Thank you, and thank you for attending this Doughty Street Chambers event to commemorate Holocaust Memorial Day. A video of the event will be uploaded onto the Doughty Street Chambers website. It just remains for me to say thank you to Oliver Lewis, who was the mastermind behind this event, put a huge amount of work into arranging it, finding the speakers, and doing everything else. Richard and Raymonda from the Doughty Street Chambers staff, to the panelists, Rabbi Naftali Schiff, Amos Waldman, Marissa Curran, John Hobson, and Rahima Mahmut. If you're looking for further resources, I'm only going to give you one place to look, which is the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust website, where you can find an enormous amount of material, both about remembering the Holocaust, about understanding the Holocaust, and also how you can act now on persecution around the world, including of the Uyghur Muslims. I would like to end, not with my own words, but with those of Elie Wiesel, who was a Holocaust survivor and a great writer. And I want to end with two of his quotes. "Wherever men and women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must, at that moment, become the center of the universe. And the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference." Thank you, everybody.